The fourth of St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, the way of gradation. He begins, as he always does with the 5 ways, with an empirical observation. He notes correctly that among beings there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like. So far, so good. It's simply saying that things come in degrees. Some people are taller, some shorter, some people are more honest, some less honest, etc. So far, so good. Now, then he immediately heads into some metaphysics. One question that arises is, of course, when you say that something is more or less good, more or less noble, what is the foundation for those claims? Now, the claim that Aquinas makes in terms of what the grounding for this is, he says this: when we predicate, when we make claims about assign qualities to things, we do so, according to him, in terms of how they resemble in different ways something that is the maximum. Put in another way, the idea essentially is this: when we say that one thing is less or more than another, we're not comparing them to each other, according to Aquinas, we're comparing them to the maximum of that type. Now, on one hand, this seems kind of odd, because if we think of like size, if we say that, say, Lena is taller than Dave, we would seem to be comparing Lena and Dave, and noting that Lena is taller than Dave. But we can also look at it in terms of how we think about with like grading. So if someone takes a test and they get a 75 and someone else gets a 90, you could say, the 90 is greater than the 74 relative to each other, but you can also look at it in terms of how close they are to the perfect score, 100, the key for the exam. And so there is some sense to this, in a way. But this is what he claims. So when we say that something is more or less good, more or less noble, more or less beautiful, we're not comparing them directly to each other, we're comparing them to the maximum of that type. So if you say that somebody is more beautiful than another, you're not comparing them to each other, you're comparing them to the most beautiful of all and finding that one is not as close as the other. In his own example, one thing is said to be hotter as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest. So that's his basic metaphysics. When you say that things are more or less in terms of qualities, it's based on a comparison not directly to each other, but to the maximum of that type. From this, he infers that since that's how we make comparisons, he claims, and again, that rests on some pretty serious philosophical assumptions, he says there must be something which is truest, something best, something noblest. There also must be, at least according to his reasoning, something which is most in being. For those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being. Now, to hopefully clear that up a bit, when normally we talk about like being, we generally think of it like existence. Something is or is not. But thinkers like Aristotle and Aquinas, they regard being as having degrees. And again, using my metaphor analogy from before, if you're familiar with like video games or role-playing games, we have characters that are different levels. And you kind of think of that as like being. So you just start off in a typical game, you're weak and most things are more powerful. But then as you gain levels, you become more powerful. And you can kind of think of it that way. So God is like the highest level, the most power. He has the most being. And lesser creatures have less power, they have less being. Now he also makes the assumption that the maximum in any genus, in any type, is the cause of all that genus. And this is something that comes up, out of Aristotle. Also, Plato, as we'll see in the future, had this view as well. And so the idea is that it's answering the question, what is the cause of, say, all fire? What is the cause of all beauty? What is the cause of all goodness? And his answer would be the maximum of that type. So what is the cause of all fire? Well, it would be the maximum fire. What is the cause of all goodness? The maximum good. And so, in the case of fire, the maximum of heat is a cause of all hot things. So his reasoning, again, rests on some serious assumptions here, namely that when we say that when things are lesser or greater, we're comparing them to the greatest of that type, not directly to each other. And the claim is that for each type of thing, like, the heat or truth and ability, the maximum of that type is a cause of all those things that fall under it. So what he then goes to is the inference that there must be something which is to all the things the cause of their being, their goodness, and every other perfection. And this we call God. So a quick kind of smushed down version of his reasoning essentially is this. We find things come in degrees. Totally true. He claims, and this is quite an assumption, that when we compare things, we're not comparing them to each other, but to the maximum of that type. So if we talk about someone being kind, we're not more kind than someone else, like Sally's more kind than Donald. We would say that we're comparing Sally and Donald to, the kindest of all. And then in terms of why each thing is what it is, according to Aquinas, the cause of all things being what they are would be the greatest of that type. So the cause of all, heat would be the greatest heat. And so what Aquinas sort of leaps to is that since there is the qualities of being, goodness, and all other qualities, there must be a single being that causes all of these. Now what he's doing here is following quite closely Plato and Aristotle's line of reasoning. There's got to be like this, entity that groups all things. For Plato, these are the forms. We'll see these in the future. But the key distinction between Plato and Aquinas here is this. As we'll see when we look at Plato in part 3, Plato splits them up into distinct entities. So there would be a form of for each quality, like form of kindness, form of nobility, form of mercy, form of justice. But Aquinas puts them all into one single being. And this being is, of course, called God. So that's the way of gradation. Things come in degrees, so God's got to exist. Next, we'll turn to the fifth and final way, the governance of the world.